Hi folks, in this unit we will be going over the second part of the chapter on tragedy and comedy, focusing on the comedy part in the Veith reading, as well as Veith's discussion of the Middle Ages and the Reformation. I'll touch on those two in my lecture. I'll focus mainly on the Inferno section of the Divine Comedy, which we're reading for this class. So we're not reading the entire comedy, we're just reading the first third of it, Inferno, Dante's Inferno, and I will try to guide you through that as best I can. I've been reading it a long time. I may have been teaching Iliad longer, but I teach Dante more frequently. He's one of my favorite authors of all time, and if I get very enthusiastic about it, that's part of the reason. All right, so let's start with the Veith reading. So Veith's discussion of comedy focuses on the idea that comedy ridicules vice, and he discusses satire too. Now, we've already encountered satire in the previous unit with Horace and the satire about his life in the city. And satire can run the gamut from gentle, self-referential satire like Horace's satire, all the way to the very caustic, harsh satire of poets like Juvenal, who was also writing in the Roman era. And Juvenal's satire could be very biting and critical and condemning even. So what do we do with comedy, though? You know, the idea of eliciting laughter. Now, Divine Comedy, I'm going to talk about that specifically because it's the text that we are reading, or at least comedy in terms of Dante. So the comedy is more reflective of reality than tragedy is from a Christian perspective. So tragedy presents to us the aspect of reality of the fall. So we live in a fallen world, things don't go well for us, we are subject to sin, our sin often undermines us. Sometimes our sin is overt and we know about it and we live in a state of rebellion. And sometimes our sin is covert and we don't know about it, and yet it also undermines us. And that element of tragedy, of the fall, of things being hopeless and not optimal is an aspect, a facet of reality that Christians agree with, right? We look at tragedy and we say, yes, there is an aspect of humanity and an aspect of reality that is like that. Comedy, on the other hand, takes the idea of tragedy, so it's still present somewhat in comedy, takes the idea of tragedy and then expands its scope, so now it entails something like restoration. Perhaps some of you learned in Shakespeare classes, or if you've done acting that featured Shakespeare or Renaissance comedy, you've probably been told, and rightly so, that comedies end with marriage. So the idea is that comedy, it's not so much that comedy ends with vows between a man and woman all the time. It often does. But the idea is that comedy, in its purest form, reiterates, reinforces social order. And comedies exclude those who are a threat to social order. So, for instance, if you read Twelfth Night by Shakespeare, you know that Malvolio is a threat to the order of the household. And even though some people feel sorry for him because he seems just like this sweet buffoonish guy who's just, like lacks self-awareness, he really is a threat because of his self-indulgence, because of his willingness to put others at risk for his own ends. Now, it's not tragedy because it's funny. Nobody's really getting hurt, in the fiction of it all. And even that, in a sense, is congruent with the idea that, with the Christian idea, that God is in governance of all things, and that all things work together for good for those who are called according to His purposes. That is a kind of expression we find in comedy. Now, I'm not saying that the gospel is comedy, like ha-ha, laugh out loud funny, but the aspect of restoration, the aspect of the positive thing hoped for actually coming to us and are having fulfillment, that is a feature of comedy that the Gospels, that is characteristic of Christian experience. So now I don't deny that comedy often is used in crass ways and is even used in oppressive ways, and Veith points that out in his chapter. He says that often comedy can be used in a way that either excludes or ignores or even makes the needy and the poor the butt of its jokes. So I don't know if you remember, but occasionally there would be shows where the host would go out on the street and ask people, like who's the president of the United States or who's the Speaker of the House, and then would feature those individuals who didn't know the answer and turn them into the butt of the joke. And I would say that's a very unchristian way of portraying comedy. Taking real people and putting them in the position of the buffoon. Now, if it's a character, a fictional character who is presented in that way, sometimes to make a point, maybe a larger point about, being knowledgeable or what have you. If it's a character, then that's a different story, right? That is not putting actual individuals at risk or reducing individuals to punchlines in jokes or laughing at their expense. That's a different situation. So, again, comedy really entails the Christian perspective even more than tragedy does, because comedy also includes the looming threat. It includes the idea that things could go very wrong, but if it ends there, it's not comedy anymore. It's just tragedy. If it goes beyond that and we get past the difficulty and we find a restoration of order, comedy. And so Dante's comedy is that kind of performance. In fact, Dante even writes to one of his friends and says, the reason I call this the comedy is not so much because we're supposed to laugh, but because it ends in the restoration of the soul. We're only reading the tragic focus of the Divine Comedy, the Inferno focus. We aren't looking at the dealing of sin from the perspective of the believer, and then the kind of like the witness or the testimony of believers in the past who encouraged Dante on the rest of his pilgrimage, right? So we're not getting that part of the Divine Comedy, just the sin as it's experienced by the unrepentant. Now, Veith also, and I'll get to that in a moment, Veith also, in our readings for this time, Veith discusses the concepts of, hang on just a second, let me pause and take a look. All right, not the concept of, but the generalities of the Middle Ages and the Reformation. So I'm a medievalist. I think I've mentioned that to you before. Not meaning that I do medieval reenactment, but meaning that my area of study focuses on medieval things from the Middle Ages. And my particular area of specialization is English literature during the Middle Ages. So Old and Middle English, mainly during the time of Chaucer, so late Middle English period. Veith's representation of the Middle Ages, I think, is pretty good. Also, just to let you know, I'm also in the Reformation tradition, right? My church is in the Reform tradition of Christianity, which looked to correct a lot of the excesses and maybe even corruptions that had accrued during the Middle Ages and were practiced by members of the clergy, which, by the way, Dante is aware of. And Dante, although he's writing centuries before the Reformation, we could think of him as something like presenting a proto-reformational view of the church, right? Dante is not out to abolish the papacy, but what he doesn't like is that diabolical men sit in the Pope's seat. So now, in the Reformed tradition, we don't affirm the necessity of a pope or anything like that. But I don't want you to think that just the presence of the papal seat in and of itself is some sort of nefarious, wicked thing. It is the intent of the individual that shapes our view of that seat, and that's what Dante focuses on when he portrays popes in hell, right? Popes in the Inferno. It's not that he's saying popes are bad. He's saying that guy Nicholas III is bad. So in any case, the presentation of the Middle Ages presented by Veith, I think, is very good. And the idea that the Reformation attempted to wade through a lot of the accrued nonsense, things like indulgences and selling pardons. In my area, there's a work called Piers Plowman. You could think of it as kind of like a pre-Pilgrim's Progress, a couple of centuries before Bunyan wrote his work. And one of the focuses on that is the criticism of like easy faith. Just like all I got to do is sign the little document that says, I have an indulgence for sin, or all I have to do is recite a rote prayer and then I'm forgiven of sin, and I don't need to display or demonstrate any change. The Reformation addressed a lot of that stuff. Piers Plowman, of course, is pre-Reformation, but it deals with some of those problems. The Reformation is an attempt to turn Christian focus to the source of their doctrines, and that's the Scriptures. So not all of the doctrines that we hold to are explicit in the Scriptures, but the doctrines that we hold to derive themselves from the Scriptures. Right? Trinity is not mentioned in the Bible, in the New Testament, or the Old Testament, but the idea of the Trinity is presented in the Old and New Testament, especially the New Testament. And the development of the doctrine of the Trinity wasn't somebody like, oh, I'm going to invent something someday. One day I've got a thought and I'm just going to, fabricate a lie out of whole cloth. No, it comes because people were saying things about Jesus and the Holy Spirit and God that were correct things and incorrect things. And so church leaders during the patristic era, from let's say the first through the 5th centuries or so, right? The years 33, the death of Christ, or thereabouts, from the death of Christ to, around the time of St. Augustine. Church leaders are trying to deal with, this kind of like hodgepodge of people's ideas and thoughts about who the Lord is, who Jesus is. And so the doctrines that come out of Christianity, some of them are explicit in the Scriptures, but some of them also are developed. Those doctrines during the course of the Middle Ages also became centers of other thoughts, right? You could get more commentary in the Scriptures than the Scriptures. If you have a Life Application Bible, for instance, that's an example of commentary, the level of commentary exceeding the amount of Scriptures. Now, I'm not saying that's always a bad thing. I'm just saying that there is a tradition of people taking the Scriptures and then meditating on them, sometimes valuably and other times maybe not so valuably. And the Reformation tries to steer the focus back to the Scriptures. Now, listen, it's more complex than that, and we're doing a literature class. So in your Bible classes, you will get maybe some fine-tuning adjustments to this view, to what I've presented to you, and show the complicated matters involved that we're not quite going to get into for our class. Let's turn our focus instead to Dante and his comedy. Now, our edition of the comedy is Musa's translation, not the comedy, the Inferno portion of the comedy, is Musa's translation of the Inferno, and he's translated the entirety of the comedy, the Purgatorio and the Paradiso also. And Musa has some very good introductory notes, and even though I'm not assigning them, if you find yourself interested in learning more about Dante and the situation behind writing the comedy, I commend his introduction to you. Dante is writing in the late 13th century, so like late 1200s into the early 14th century. In fact, he starts writing the comedy around 1307. Probably, we think he starts writing it around 1307. And he's writing it thinking about something that happened in the year 1300 when he was 35 years old. And we know he was 35 when this experience happened, not when he started writing. When this experience happened, because he says, halfway through life's journey, I found myself in a dark wood. And he gets halfway through life's journey, a poetic device to say that he's 35 years old. He gets that from the Psalms, where David says that the span of a man's life is 70 years, or 80 if he has strength. And now Dante is not necessarily saying that that's a scientific fact, because Dante is no fool. He knew that people lived in, sometimes only lived into their 60s, or sometimes could even live past their 80s. And pause the class for a second. So it is a mistake to think that the average lifespan during the Middle Ages was like 30 years old or something like that, or 20 years old. That is a mistake that comes from a kind of statistical ism that calculates average age, including things like infant mortality and people not making it past, I think, like their 7th birthday or something like that. So there is this high mortality rate among the young during the Middle Ages, and probably during ancient times too, that we don't quite have today. But that calculating that in is what gets us to this absurd falsity. It's a falsity that people only lived into their 30s. People regularly lived into their 60s, 70s, and 80s, and occasionally people would live into their 90s, which would be remarkable, and somebody would say, hey, so-and-so has lived a longer life. But when people lived into their 70s, the lack of comment on it indicates that it's nothing noteworthy. All right, so back to Dante. So poetically, he's saying that halfway through life's journey, I was in this terrible place, writing in the early 14th century. So Dante, I'll give you just a touch of his political background, because that informs the comedy for sure, but it is a kind of rabbit hole that we can't quite get into for our class. Now, I've done independent studies with students before, and we've explored this a little bit more, but for the purposes of our class, I'll just say that Dante was involved in, there was a specific instance that I want to focus on. He was involved in a party called I think it was the Black Guelphs, the Guelph Party, and let me just double check that. The White Guelphs, right? So they believe that there should be this divide between church and state. Now listen, the Guelph and Ghibelline tensions, which predated even Dante, those are themselves a complex matter, and even the Guelphs, who start out in opposition to the Ghibelline, fracture and fragment into two different camps, one of which, the White Guelphs, comes back around to the Ghibelline position, namely that the church should govern spiritual affairs and that the emperor or the king should govern secular affairs. Whatever the case may be, Dante is an ambassador, or part of an embassy, sent to Pope Boniface VIII in the year I think it's late 1290s, early 1300s. 1302. Okay, so Dante is detained. One of the ambassadors detained, and then all of the ambassadors who were part of this party are declared outlaws for our intents and purposes. They're declared outlaws. And there is an order issued to arrest Dante when he re-enters the city of Florence. So he just never goes back to Florence. And when he doesn't go back, that warrant for his arrest turns into, kind of like a writ of execution. If he comes back, he'll be killed. So Dante lives the rest of his life in exile, and this outlawing happens because Boniface VIII, as Dante saw it, had betrayed his intentions to help Florence. So now that's, for our class, that's going to be enough. And this animosity and anger that Dante harbors, it seems like he's working through that as part of writing the Divine Comedy. But it's not the only thing he's working through. I think he's also working through his own propensity to sin, and even his desire for a woman who was not his wife, Beatrice. You may have heard of her, Dante and Beatrice, this famous star-crossed lovers. So Dante, in the late 1290s, writes a work called the Vita Nuova, in which we see he's actually breaking from poetic tradition, where Beatrice would be an object of desire and maybe sexual desire. The idealized woman who is treated almost as just an object, who has no virtue, and becomes like a canvas on which to paint the poet's love, desires, or forlornness, or whatever. Over the course of writing the Vita Nuova, Dante, we see this shift happening in Dante, where he realizes writing this kind of poetry about Beatrice belittles her and diminishes her statue. And by the end of the Vita Nuova, which is in 30, I think it's 34 sections, something along those lines. By the end of the Vita Nuova, we find Dante has actually changed his mind about Beatrice as this object of desire, and now she's starting to take on a representation of the ideal, because Dante had done a disservice to her through desiring her in false ways or sinful ways. Some scholars believe that Dante still retained romantic feelings for Beatrice. I'm going to betray a little bit of snarkiness on my part. So many of those scholars have read the comedy and have read Dante's writing, as have I. But I wonder if they haven't paid attention to it, because by the beginning of the Paradiso, Beatrice actually doesn't appear until the end of the Purgatorio, so we won't even see her in the Inferno section of the comedy. By the time Beatrice appears to Dante in the Divine Comedy, she is a cold and distant figure whose main purpose is to rebuke Dante, tell him where he's mistaken. She even calls him brother at one point. We talk about like friend zoning a person. Well, she brother zones Dante, and that is Dante the poet is creating this character of Beatrice to do that to Dante the character in the poem. And I think that's Dante's signal. Look, I'm over her in this false romantic way, and I see her in the way that Christ sees her. Now, he doesn't come out quite and say that. Actually, Beatrice uses those words of herself in the Paradiso, where she's rebuking Dante. There's a lot of finger pointing by Beatrice towards Dante the Pilgrim in the Divine Comedy. So Dante, in any case, something happened also to free Dante's mind from these false views of love, and some of that is going on in the Divine Comedy, the entire journey of the Divine Comedy. And I think, and I'm not the only one who thinks this, but it seems like one of the pivotal figures to help Dante is Virgil. He must have been reading Virgil's poetry. Now, he could never have met Virgil, because Virgil lived 13 centuries before Dante was even thought of. So Dante was likely reading Virgil, maybe the Aeneid, maybe the Georgics, maybe the Eclogues. I know for sure that he was reading the Georgics because of the detail about the architecture of the Inferno, and I know he was reading the reading the Aeneid because of another detail in the third circle of hell with Cerberus. So I know for sure he was reading those two works, and probably had read the Eclogues too. It would be a surprise if he didn't. Classical learning was widespread at the time. At least Roman writers were. He would have read Homer too, but probably a Latin translation of Homer. In any case, probably during reading Virgil, he had an aha moment. Now, some might accuse Dante of impiety because it wasn't the scriptures that gave him this aha moment, but perhaps some of you have also had these eye-opening experiences apart from Scripture. Not that negated Scripture, but they happened outside of Scripture. I know personally I could testify to you that I was reading a work of American literature. This was decades ago in my life, and felt an acute conviction of sin that actually kind of like burst open and facilitated a real change in my life. Now, that doesn't mean that that American author was divinely inspired. All it means is that the Lord was using that in order to save me, and it seems like the Lord was using the work of Virgil in order to get Dante, to rally Dante in some way. All right, now, that's just kind of a brief background on Dante and what's going on, or the situation of the Inferno. There are a few key concepts that I want you to know, and you should know these because I will test you on them. They will be asked on the test. So, Dante, in a work called the Convivio, which was his attempt to do kind of like a systematic, encyclopedic writing about everything, right? Something like a Summa Theologia. In the Convivio, the second book of the Convivio, Dante outlines 4 modes of reading. Really, there are 2 modes of reading, but he thinks of 4 types. And he inherits these, actually, at least from Augustine, because Augustine also talks about these modes of reading in places like De Doctrina Christiana and City of God, and he may even talk about it, I think, in Confessions. So Dante didn't invent them, but these modes of reading are important enough for him to mention, and also show that he is thinking about these modes of reading even as he's writing as a poet. So when we read in these modes, we want to, rather than saying, oh, I think we're reading too much into this, what we should be saying is, are we reading enough out of it? Are we recognizing enough of what Dante already put into it for us to mine out of it? The danger with Dante is not over-reading, it's under-reading. And you could look up things like his letter to Congrande, his friend, where he goes through these, interpretive, it's like an interpretive high wire act where he's talking about, this is what I mean, this is how I mean this idea. He even says the entire Divine Comedy is really an expression, a metaphorical expression of the exodus of the human soul from from Egypt, right? From the prison of sin. So this is how Dante thinks. He thinks in this way. All right, so these 4 modes of reading are the historical mode, or literal mode. We could call it the literal mode of reading. And that is basically the text at its surface level. So at the literal mode, Dante literally met the poet Virgil in a dark wood and then went underground into the Inferno. Literally, that's what's happening. Or in the literal mode, that's what's happening. But then there's the metaphorical mode, or sometimes called the allegorical mode. And that allegorical mode can be divided into 3 categories. And we could call one of them just allegory, right? Something like just metaphor. And that would be something along the lines of Virgil, who's literally the Roman poet, walking around with Dante. In the metaphorical mode, Virgil represents human reason. Now, there's a reason Virgil cannot accompany Dante into the Paradiso, because he's not saved. So some people have heard, for instance, that Dante believes you could go from hell to purgatory to heaven. He does not believe that. He says, even in the Inferno, he says, those who are in the Inferno are there forever. The only exception would be Adam and Abraham. There's a medieval doctrine, it survives even into the modern day in some denominations. There's this medieval doctrine that all of the dead went to the same place. The righteous dead went to the bosom of Abraham, and the unrighteous dead went to perdition to be punished. And then Christ, when he died and descended into hell, as the Nicene Creed says, when he descended into hell and then preached to the captives, interpreters looked at that as Christ going down basically and saying, look, devil, you thought you had all of these people under your ownership, but I'm a bit of a legal contract guy myself, and I have freed those who believe in me by faith. And so he brings them out of hell. Now, whether or not you believe in those particulars, that's what Dante thinks. So he does not believe that the damned can go from Inferno to Purgatorio to heaven. He absolutely would repudiate that. But there are people who are, we might call them righteous pagans. They don't get to go to heaven. Now, if you are in the Reformed tradition and you are a predestinationist or electionist or something, I mean, in the Reformed tradition we often emphasize that. Dante is even heavier on that than those in the Reformed tradition are often. Calvin wishes he was as hard a predestination guy as Dante. Dante emphasizes the idea of election. Now that's usually in the Purgatorio and the Paradiso, which we're not reading. But Dante does see the righteous pagans as having maybe less suffering. It's still suffering. When they are in the first circle of hell, they're not like, oh, thank goodness we have a place of our own. They're sighing. You could almost think of it as just an extension of the hard life on earth where there's no hope. Now, as unfair as that may sound, that's just how Dante sees it, and Virgil is one of those individuals who is now going to help Dante as a metaphor of human reason. Now, human reason can only get you so far, and it takes divine revelation in order to go from the earth to heaven, right, to transcend that boundary, and that is only through the grace of God. That's, in fact, one of the metaphors in the Purgatorio is about God's grace being the only way that anybody can do anything on Mount Purgatory. So, back to the modes of reading. At the literal level, there's Virgil, the Roman poet. At the metaphorical or allegorical level, just plain metaphor, Virgil represents human reason. Now, another mode in that symbolic kind of mode would be a moral mode. Lessons that we could learn from the situations in a text. So perhaps we could see Virgil in the moral mode as the realization that we ought or we must engage our reason, our human reason must recognize sin for what it really is. And that would be a moral mode of reading. So Virgil becomes a way to express the human reason needing to see sin as sinful. And then the other mode, the fourth mode, is what we would call the anagogical mode. All right, I'll spell it for you. A-N-A-G-O-G-I-C-A-L, anagogical. And the anagogical mode is something like a big picture mode. So the anagogical way of reading Virgil might be that all people who experience salvation at some level have to have their reason regenerated. So Virgil doesn't get to go to heaven because his reason isn't regenerated, and the anagogical understanding is all people have to have their reason regenerated. Now, he's not saying that everybody has to have reasoning and can reason through theology, because, certainly there were people who would be classified as, simpletons or idiots, and I don't mean that I'm using the terminology of the day. People who are mentally incapable of perhaps reasoning through certain things. Dante would say, nevertheless, whether they're able to reason or not, God still regenerates their reason, and that's a prerequisite into going to heaven, and it's by God's grace that he does it. So Dante wouldn't deny, that those individuals could go to heaven too. In fact, in his schema, they could. All right, so those are four modes of reading that you need to know: literal mode, the straight metaphorical mode, just purely metaphorical mode, the moral mode, which is kind of another kind of allegory, and then the anagogical mode, which is maybe a big picture view, like saying something universal or something universally true. So I will ask you about those things. Now, in the Inferno, we have an architecture of hell that is imaginative. Dante did not believe that hell actually looked like this. He's borrowing his description from Virgil, In the fourth Georgic, when Orpheus goes into the underworld to win back Eurydice, Virgil describes Orpheus as witnessing the 9 rings of the Styx River. And the 9 rings of the Styx River, of course, is something that Dante picks up on and reappropriates into his architecture, signaling to his audience, this is a poetry. I'm doing poetry. I'm not telling lies. I'm just presenting in this decorated language, in this decorated presentation, the ideas of sin and their devastating effects on sinners. So the 9 levels of hell are not some... Certainly there were people in the Middle Ages who read Dante and thought, oh, there must be 9 literal levels. Certainly there were a few of those, I'm sure. And there have been a number of them after Dante's time who thought also that Dante was doing something literal. He is not. He's not doing that. It's symbolic, right? The architecture is symbolic, and he's drawing it from Virgil. His architecture splits hell into 2 broad categories represented by the 3 beasts he meets in the first canto. The first beast that he meets is the leopard, and this represents a category of malice known as, a category of malice known as fraud, where you intentionally have ill will toward another. Now, it could be simple fraud like pimps trying to get people to go with their prostitutes. It's like they don't care about the prostitute. They don't care about the John. Sorry, I accidentally hit the pause button. They don't care about the prostitutes. But it's fraud, so they are in hell for it. And then you have complex fraud, where people, they know they're deceiving, but they're deceiving others who think that they're being honest. A person soliciting a prostitute, there's no deception there about the sin going on, but it's still a disordered will, right? It's malicious. It's the will, the reason, knowingly turning to the wrong thing. With complex fraud, it is the will trying to deceive others. In any case, all of this fraud is represented by the leopard. And we could classify circles 8 and 9 as the circles of the leopard. The second beast that Dante meets is the lion. This is another category of malice that's called violence. So it could be violence against another person. It could be violence against the self. It could be violence against nature. It could be violence against art, right? All of those things could be violence against doctrine. All of those things are kind of mixed up in there. It's still disordered will, but usually there's not a plan. Nobody set out to be like, I am going to do this thing that I know is wrong. It's just maybe sinning on impulse, and somebody might say, well, is Dante saying that that's okay? No, they're in the inferno also. So all of these individuals are being punished there. So we have the leopard, which represents sins of fraud, that category of malice called fraud, and the lion, who represents the category of malice called violence. All right, so the malice category is covered by those 2 beasts. That category. The second category, characterized by the third beast that Dante meets, is the she-wolf, who represents sins of appetite. These are the sins that dog us, where we... It's like sins of appetite usually include things like gluttony. I ate too much. Well, that's a sin. Or, I'm really attracted to this person, and I find myself maybe in a situation I shouldn't be in. That's a sin. It's where the appetite drives reason. So the reason has been disordered to a subservient role, where appetite becomes the leader, which is inappropriate, and Dante classifies, he didn't invent this classification, but he sees it as sins of appetite, and that's the one that really demoralizes Dante, right? It's like, maybe I can get around the leopard. He even says similar words like that whenever he meets Geryon down as they're traveling from the 7th to the 8th circle of the Inferno. Maybe he can get around fraud. maybe he could even pride himself on not being a malicious person. But when it comes to appetite, though, and maybe even a connection to Beatrice in his former ways of thinking, it seems like appetite undoes him, and that's when he loses all hope of ever climbing toward the light that he sees from this dark wood, which is a representation of salvation. He can't get there on his own because sin is right there, turning him away. And it's only in the recognition of sin through his journey into the inferno that he has the ability to confess it and be purged of it as one of the elect. Now, the inferno is a dark work. It is enclosed. I feel claustrophobic sometimes when I read it. It's stuffy. The smells, the sounds, sometimes the sights, sometimes the non-sights are alarming in the inferno. And that's not Dante saying, hey, I'm going to write a horror movie and be sensational. That's Dante saying sin is ugly and sin has a terrifying aspect to it. And I pose this question to my classes not just to like have a gotcha moment, but a real question. This is a legitimate question. What if sin is actually worse than what Dante portrays in the Inferno? And what if hell is actually worse than what Dante portrays in the Inferno? And Dante's characters even say, when he's going through the Inferno, they even say, this is not our final resting place. After the second judgment, we're all going to the lake of fire, and who knows what it'll be like then. So Dante is alluding to this worseness of sin in his journey through Inferno. Now, a couple of remarkable things in his journey, one of which is the barrier, the gates of Dis. This stands between the fifth circle, the circle of wrath, where the wrath is being punished, and the circle of the heretics, the sixth circle, which are right inside the gates of Dis. Medusa stands guard at the gates of Dis. That represents hardness of heart. It's no accident that Medusa, who turns things to stone, is the guardian of the gate to the sins of reason. And Dante is signaling to the reader that it takes deliberate effort to disorder the will and sin unto your reason, which is why Satan is at the bottom of that hole. It's not like Satan accidentally, like he's a misunderstood guy. No, he consciously went against reason or intellect, went against intellect and persisted in his sin. So that's a noteworthy matter in this journey in the Inferno. Another noteworthy matter, is in the barrier between circles 7 and 8. So he's already in the sins of malice. Circle 7 are the sins of the lion. So circles 1 through 5, she-wolf. Or maybe 2 through 5, she-wolf. Circle 7, maybe 6, definitely 7, sins of the lion. Now he's going down into circle 8, sins of the leopard. And he has to ride down another barrier, the beast Geryon. And that symbolizes not only the disordering of the will that it takes to move into malice, right? The badness, willful doing of wrong. To fly down into fraud requires a plan and requires a signal. And when Virgil throws Dante's belt over to signal to Geryon, the beast of fraud, Dante says, I thought I would capture the leopard with that belt. And it may be that Dante thought his work somehow would lead to salvation. He has to throw that away and face deception in order to see how bad it is. And it's also no accident, going back to the gates of Dis, that Virgil can't break in. That's Dante's signal to the reader, look, I have not committed this reprobate sin of the will. My problem is appetite, and it required a special dispensation to get through that door. But he still has to see how bad it is. And he even commits some sins of ill will down there in those lower levels of hell, especially in Circle 9. All right, the final noteworthy matter I want to bring up happens in Canto 34 when they encounter Satan. Now, a lot of students are surprised at the kind of presentation of Satan we get. We get an immobilized Satan. Yes, his wings are kind of moving slowly, but how's he represented? As a windmill, a big old building, not as some sort of dynamic, powerful demon. He's silent. He doesn't even speak. His mouth, he's got three faces, which is also an allegorical presentation. But his mouths are stuffed with sinners, and his tears are flowing down his face. He has no power. Dante's portrayal of Satan, I think, is one of the more realistic portrayals of Satan's ultimate power, which is that he's ultimately not powerful. Certainly Satan has the ability to manipulate people and to meddle in affairs, but from a Christian perspective, we would say, well, he can't kill the soul, he can kill the body, and that, in a manner of speaking, and I don't want to diminish the deaths of martyrs, and Dante doesn't do this either. I don't want to diminish the real agonies that Christians have experienced. What I'm saying is that Dante is presenting a Satan that's ultimately powerless in the face of the universe, right? Satan is at the bottom of the universe in Dante's scheme. We could argue all day long about realism and this, that, and the other thing. But in the poetic view of Satan that Dante is presenting, we have an individual that doesn't even complain. He doesn't even get to present his case like, I've been misunderstood. It's previous medieval poets that do that, or later Milton does it. So Dante is really presenting an extremely impotent view, powerless view of Satan, and even may portray him as a buffoon, because in order to get past Satan, Virgil grabs onto his legs, and he's carrying Dante with him. So human reason is grappling with the reality of Satan and carrying Dante through to the other side. And what does he see? He sees Satan's legs sticking up, like in the I think it's the fifth or the sixth ditch of the eighth circle, where Pope Nicholas III's legs are sticking up. He looks like a fool. And so after encountering Satan, the reason sees Satan for what he is. And that's this foolish buffoon who's powerless and immobilized. He's not even kicking his legs. They're just kind of sticking up there. I'm doing the kicking part. They're just sticking up there. And that's when the journey now towards sanctification for the believer, for the elect, gets underway. And unfortunately, our reading stops with Dante emerging from the Inferno and seeing the stars, and Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso all end with the word stars. And that's Dante, I think, signaling something about God's ordination or ordaining and ordering of all things. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's my presentation, my overview. It's very brief, I realize, but it's my overview of Dante's, the Inferno portion of Dante's comedy. We don't have another dialogue assignment until week 5, so save your questions about Dante for week 5. If something is eating you up and you need to ask about it, send me an email. Do not hesitate to send me an email. I will answer it as soon as I can. And I told you I love the comedy. I want students to understand, even if they don't agree doctrinally with specific things that Dante says. I would like you as students to see the value in Dante's journey, to recognize sin for its ugliness, and be spurred on toward God because of it. So think of it as maybe, in addition to the literary aspects we are studying, think of it as a spur to devotional meditation on God's goodness. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Remember, for this unit, I will definitely ask you about those 4 modes of reading, and I will ask you about the 3 beasts and what they entail in Dante's representation. All right, folks, take care. Bye-bye.